Hello, and welcome to our panel about forgiveness. So nice to see all your faces, even though it's kind of blinding lights for us. So despite being a Christian from the time that I was 8 years old, I really didn't see the benefit of considering forgiveness in solving social problems like crime until about 2020. You would think that with my mother, so my mother was actually incarcerated in Iran. She was a political activist against the current regime of Iran. And she was incarcerated, and at the time, we never knew how that happened. Who turned her in, right? How did that even come about that my mother was incarcerated? Well, I didn't learn until a few years ago that it was actually a close member of our family, a family relative who was the one that turned my mother in to the regime, which ended up having her be sentenced for 10 years for treason. And I think, maybe like my mother and, like others who quietly deal with forgiveness, I've kind of thought about forgiveness as this individual thing, right? Something that we deal with alone at home, right? With ourselves, maybe with God if we're religious people. And I never considered its role in a more societal sense of what is the kind of societal role of forgiveness. And my recent research, we've heard a lot in this world about systemic racism or, systemic inequality, but we haven't heard a lot about systemic forgiveness. And so my latest work is called Systemic Absolution. It's looking at what is the role of society? How do we, as people in a civic society, deal with people who have committed crimes against us, even, horrible crimes against us? Do we punish them forever? Do we cast them off? Do we imprison them? Is there any hope for redemption for those people, for us as a society? Typically, these crimes are dealt with individually and not as a societal level. So I'd love to open the conversation, not just with this panel, but in general, in our thinking about forgiveness as, is there a role for us to forgive those that we don't know? Not those who have individually affected us, but those who have harmed others. And is there a role for us in our faith in trying to forgive those people? I first saw an idea of using this kind of collective forgiveness with one of my heroes in the criminal justice space. Her name's Robin Steenberg. She wrote the book Courage of Compassion. She's also a very famous bail advocate, and I spent many of years of my criminal law work looking at bail. And what she did is she was trying to advocate on behalf of one of her clients in an appeal, in a criminal justice appeal, and she's Jewish, and she brought up this idea of the Jewish scapegoat. And what she explained to the jury in New York, she said, listen, there's this old Jewish ritual that we believe in where the community would come together once a year. And in order to forgive the whole community of every crime and every sin that had happened in that community, we will let one goat escape into the wilderness. And once that goat has gone away, then all the sins and crimes of that community were all gone and forgotten. No one else would be punished, no resentments will be held. And that's how, as I read this story, I thought, it gave me chills because I thought, this is what we need to do. We need to have religion teach us as a society how to forgive these crimes that we're holding on to and harboring for years. And she ended up getting her client the relief that she wanted. It was very successful. And so anyway, I'm hoping that this conversation will lead to more discussion about this. Now, I'm not going to give you full introductions to our panelists, who I'm really excited to introduce, but I will tell you a little bit about each of them. So we have Corinna Barrett Lain. She is the S.D. Roberts and Sandra Moore Professor of Law at University of Richmond School of Law. Her scholarship focuses on Supreme Court decision-making and the death penalty. She's published numerous articles and essays, and her works appeared in top journals, including Stanford Law Review, Penn Law Review, Duke Law Journal, UCLA, and many other avenues. I am so excited. She's written this book in April. I read the first bit. I'm excited to finish the rest of it. It's called Secrets of the Killing State, the Untold Story of Lethal Injection. So she will draw on her expertise on death penalty work in her remarks today. We then have a good colleague and friend of mine, Jenae Nelson. She has expertise in developmental psychology. She's currently an assistant professor in the psychology department at BYU, completed some postdoc research at Baylor, has done a lot of cool research with Harvard Medical School, studied the neuroscience of spirituality. Her expertise lies in the cultivation of character traits such as gratitude and compassion, and the positive impacts of religion and spirituality on youth development. Her work's been featured in Christianity Today and other outlets. And then we have another dear friend of mine, Elder Don Clarke. He is a General Authority 70 Emeritus of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Before he was Emeritus, he was sustained as a member of the first Quorum of the 70 in 2011. His career before that included senior executive positions in several retailing companies, which I think contributed to his great success in current ventures. Since 2021, Elder Clarke became the president of the church's Utah Correctional Facilities District. And he'll tell you more about that. It's what I've seen, the most expansive and impressive religious volunteer operation in prisons that I've ever even heard of. And so I'm so excited to hear from all of them. I'm going to give them the first panel question. It is for all the panelists to answer. The question is, our criminal justice system often operates on principles of deterrence and retributivism and retribution. Most statutes focus on retributive aims, and the prevailing theory of criminal philosophy lacks a focus on forgiveness or change. What would it mean to build a system rooted in redemption and restoration instead of what we have? And is it even possible when dealing with the most serious crimes like murder or sexual abuse?
Do I start?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. I wasn't sure. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So what would it mean, to be very specific? In my world, I would say it would mean a world without the death penalty, a world without executions. And I will say I'm a former prosecutor. My specialty was prosecuting child sexual assaults. So I think a lot about the victims and about these terrible crimes that I'm studying. And I am going to pull from this work. You know, this was a 7-year project of studying executions. But in the process of studying executions, it gave me a front row seat of who these people are at the end. Like, not who they were at the time of their crime, not who they were even at the time of their trial, but who are they 10, 15, 20, 25 years later. Later this month, I think it's June 24th, in the United States, a man will be executed. He's been on death row 49 years. 49 years. And most of these people have been on death row 25, 30 years. And so for me, what was surprising, and I'm sort of disappointed in myself that I am surprised. I'm like, wait a minute, redemption for me, but not for thee? You know, like, why did that surprise me so much? But I am just so moved by the stories of redemption on death row and what the implications are for that. So I thought I'd just share two real quickly,
Yes,
and then I'll pass. One is on forgiveness, but the other is on sort of the redemption piece. And I write in the epilogue, I just have a little 3-page epilogue where I'm like, by the way, here's a thing I saw. And I write about this man named Brian Dorsey. So I have a Google News feed, and you know, I get things that come across my desk. I was writing the epilogue, which there's a whole faith journey behind the book, and I was really moved to write an epilogue. And so I'm writing the epilogue. Brian Dorsey, this op-ed comes across my desk, and it's about this guy in Missouri named Brian Dorsey. And the title of it is, "We corrections officers know Brian Dorsey has changed. Governor Parsons don't execute him." And I thought, corrections officers. This is interesting. I'm going to read this. And so this guy had been convicted of a double murder. It's 17 years later, and over 70 prison guards, including the 2 wardens, signed a petition to the governor to try to commute his sentence. And one thing to think about that a lot of people don't know is they're never getting out. It's death or life without parole. So they're never getting out. So they're trying to move for him to live out his days. And what they talked about was that he lived in the honor dorm of the prison. And I don't know what it takes for a condemned capital murderer to get to the honor dorm, but he was in the honor dorm. And he had served as the prison barber for over 10 years. And he cut the hair not only of all the other prisoners, but by choice of all of the prison guards, including the 2 wardens. So think about what that looked like. A condemned capital murderer with a pair of scissors and a razor blade at the warden's neck again and again. And this is what they say. They say, and I'm quoting the op-ed, "Mr. Dorsey is an excellent barber and a kind and respectful man. There isn't a nicer guy than Brian." And they went on to say, taking Dorsey's life, I'm quoting the op-ed, "Taking Dorsey's life would be especially traumatizing for the many current and former prison staff members, myself included, who have come to respect and care for this exemplary inmate." Now, the governor denied that request, and the prison guards that had come to know and respect this man then had to kill him. And so this is just one of the stories and things that I'm thinking about. What would it look like? And then, because the theme is forgiveness, I'll tell one more. This is Alabama, and a man they executed, Jimmy Barber. So I sent you the article that this was about. It was all reported in a really nice article in the Atlantic. But I think it was her grandmother that was killed, or maybe it was her mother, and she ends up, so this is a daughter or granddaughter of the victim who was slain. She writes this man a letter. She says, "I'm tired, Jimmy, tired of carrying this pain, hate, and rage in my heart. I can't do it anymore. I have to finally forgive you." He writes back, "Dear Sarah, your letter was the most uplifting moment I have experienced, short of October 6, 2001, when I forced the county jail to baptize me for the remission of my sins to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sorry could never come close to what is in my heart and soul, the self-loathing, shame, shock, and disbelief of what I did almost overcame me. If not for God's grace, I'd be gone." She writes back, "You have freed me. Receiving your letter was the final piece of freedom. The weight was lifted when I forgave you, but your response was the final release. I have no anger, zero. I feel as if 1,000 pounds was lifted from my soul. I'm sorry it took me so long to write." The victim's family member apologizing to the condemned capital murderer. "I'm sorry it took me so long to write." But these are the stories that I'm seeing over and over again. And so even though the book is not about that, the last 3 pages are, and I think that's why you invited me.
Yeah, for many reasons, as everyone can see.
Thank you for giving so many powerful examples there and stories that will really reinforce what I hope to share. So as a developmental psychologist, my number one goal is to understand how people develop. And I have a unique investment in people developing well and developing towards flourishing and thriving and becoming the best versions of themselves. Our systems and our laws and our institutions say a lot about what we believe about human nature. And they say a lot about what we believe about what types of behaviors that we want to reinforce, and how do we do that? How do we change behaviors? And is it possible to change? having an orientation, a system orientation towards forgiveness and change would make some assumptions about human nature, that change is possible, and that this is something that we could actually observe in individuals. And we find that the neuroscience actually supports this. In fact, if you don't believe that people can change, you're actually going against what we know about neuroscience and neuroplasticity. So we know that people can change, they have the propensity to change. So if you know that, then you also have to ask, well, what causes change and what leads to that change? Well, there's a lot of things that lead to change. From a relational developmental systems paradigm, we like to look at systems, relationships, and understand that human behavior is quite complex, and it's not only the individual that is performing these, that is responsible for all of these decisions, but that there's systems in place that are reinforcing or helping these behaviors. So when you want to understand a behavior, you have to think about the various levels, the ecological levels that that individual is nested within. So if we have a system that doesn't believe in change, or at least is not allowing for change or forgiveness, what does that tell us? And what does that tell individuals? What kind of messaging does that send to young people? I think that having systems that allow for change, and not only allow for change, but then actually work to promote that change, we're sending a different message. We're giving a message of hope. And that message of hope is also something that is directly connected to our willingness to change, which is ironic. So there's this bidirectional effect that if you're hopeless, you don't want to change. That's also a classic sign of depression. But when you have hope, then not only do you think you can change, but then you work towards that change. Systems that believe in change, promote change, and develop change give people hope. And so if a system that operated off of principles of forgiveness and believed in change, ironically would produce more change, because of this, what we call a virtuous cycle that happens. And there's plenty of psychological research that we could talk about that would reinforce these principles. The problem is that it's more difficult. It's more work, because then we have to take responsibility for others' actions and say that as a system, as a community, as a culture, as a society, we are actually responsible for some of the behaviors of the individuals. And therefore, we need to help each other out. We need to invest in programs and systems that will help to develop the best version of those people. And that's, like I said, that's more work. But if you're willing to do more work and you're willing to invest in people, invest in the development of people, and to give a message of hope and change, then it's that virtuous cycle that will only reinforce itself and then produce greater change in the long run. So from a developmental perspective, it's actually in our best interest to take on this type of approach towards change, and specifically our orientation towards criminals. So one last thought, this is actually from my heritage. I'm Anishinaabe, and the language that my ancestor speaks is Ojibwe-Moan, and there is not a word for criminal in Ojibwe-Moan because it's a verb-based language. So instead of an identity label, they say the person who stole the thing. That's how they would talk about a criminal, which is quite interesting. So they're separating the individual from the behavior. I think this is another thing that would help us to take this posture of forgiveness if we can disentangle the behaviors from the individual, and then take, like I mentioned before, take responsibility as a culture, as a society, for those behaviors and how that society and culture contributed to those behaviors, then there would be, like I mentioned, more hope. And I think that what a system with forgiveness has is hope.
Love that.
It's an honor for me to be here today and to participate in this wonderful discussion. So just let me tell you a little about who I am and what I do. I am currently like the stake president, district president over the Utah State Prison. That includes 10 branches. So when I got the letter from the first presidency of the church, it says you're like the stake president. So I tell all stake presidents I have more problems than any stake president in the church. I'm the only one with all their members in prison. This is a group of people that is underserved and treated different than they should be. I'm in there all the time. I come to know who they are. When I sit on the stand and look out at them, I know they're not the individuals that came in. Yeah. And so we serve, there's 6,100 men and women in the Utah, in the correctional facilities that pertain to the prison. Of those people, 70% of them have been to an activity of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have 200 volunteers that provide 125,000 hours of loving service to those individuals. And we watch them change. We watch them find the hope that Jenae talked about. I've done many callings in the church. I'm not sure that I've had a better calling than this calling. Because in this calling, what I've come to find is the power of the atonement in helping men that have done terrible things, awful things, become different. In society, what we need to do in society is we need to find out that we can forgive. I think sometimes they're treated like lepers. And so when the Savior approached the leper, what happened? Everybody else went away, and he healed the leper. When men come out of prison, or women, many times they're not welcome. And we as a society, you, me, need to change and decide that we can do something to help them continue to be better. We talked about how they're becoming. I could tell you story after story. I have some I'll share a little later. But I've watched what can happen when society decides that these people, well, let me tell you a little story. So every Tuesday, we have people that go in and pick up, is release day at this Utah State Prison. There's always some leftovers. Nobody came to pick them up. It's out by the airport, so you know it's not a place you can easily get to find something. So I have two individuals who are my counselors. One has been serving 14 years in the prison, one 8 years, because that's how good it is. Every Tuesday they show up to take these men somewhere, every Tuesday. The other day, or in the winter, there was a group of men coming out who was going to need a ride. And he recognized one of my counselors, and he came out without a coat. So my counselor took off his coat, and he said, I think this will fit. He put it on, and it fit. There was a lady sitting there, and she looked at my counselor and says, who are you? And he told her who she was, and he said this. She said this. She was there to pick up somebody. You treat them like human beings. Now, that coat story tells a lot for all of us, but it really tells you who my counselor has become. Like I say, this is the best calling in the church. As good as it gets. And so each of us today can make a difference if we decide to come to know that he can forgive and make better. I'll tell you one more story and then we'll move on. I look at I got a little more time. We had an individual from the South that was in the prison. He was there for 30 years. He had killed his wife because she was getting his children on drugs. He could have negotiated and got out in 15, but he didn't want to do that because he wanted to serve the whole time. He comes to know the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the prison. Like I say, we offer activities every morning, afternoon, and evening. 125,000 hours. So he started to come, and he found Christ. And so when he got out, we have 2 branches on the outside where we welcome people that aren't welcome in other places. And so he came to that unit and he started to receive the missionary lessons. He was recently baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and went to do baptisms for the dead, for those that understand that. But more importantly, it's what's happened to him. And so this conversation of who these people are becoming, I wish that some of the things they do, I wish I could be that good. We have a guy that recently we were talking to, and he did hideous things between the age of 7 and 42. Things that we wouldn't even want to talk about here today. But age 42, he got caught, and he went to jail. His mother gave him scriptures, and he started to read them. He read the Book of Mormon 4 times in 6 months. At that time, he changed. He never did anything since that date, now 16 years ago, till today. But what he does do is this. He gets up every morning at 3:30. Why? To pray for 1/2 hour. Then, for the next hour, he studies his scriptures so he can become like him. Then he goes to work. He does that Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. On Sunday and Saturday, he sleeps in a little bit, but he still does this process. He says, if I stop, I lose connection. So this business of who they become, we have men that are going to die in prison that should not die in prison. They're in wheelchairs. They're in wheelchairs. They couldn't hurt anybody anyway. But that's where they're going to die. But it doesn't matter to us because we're going to help them become. Because over there is a life. And they're going to take over there who they've become. And the opportunity to help these individuals has changed me. I'm not sure who the benefactor is, them or me. More. So once again, it's an honor to be here today. Shima said I could tell stories more than you want to listen to. So
You can tell all the stories. I'm sure you all agree, right?
with that, we'll move on here.
I want to share one quick story that deals with what Elder Clarke was just talking about. I definitely kind of a guilty party in this, so I'll tell you an embarrassing story about myself. But so 15 years I've been a law professor. Only in the last 5 have I really kind of considered principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ that I've been a convert to since I was 8. But only really when I started teaching at BYU 2 years ago did I really try to grapple with my faith as what I believed in criminal justice. And so most of my career, it's all been data and empirical things, and let's talk to judges and let's show this data. And at BYU, I started grappling with, wait, what does it mean to be a Christian first before a criminal justice advocate? And I had a student that sat in the front row, and he, a couple weeks into class, he's like, Professor Baughman, you're always talking about mercy, 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 mercy. He's like, is there any crime that you think should be punished more? And I couldn't think of anything. And the next class, he came back to me, well, what, have you thought of something? And no. So 2 weeks later, I'm like, how do I think of something? And then I went to what my gut said, which was, people that harm children. So sex offenders. Okay, I'll give you that. And I felt okay about it for a minute, but then I went home, and as I'm thinking about what I'm, my focus, and I walk in to my classroom to teach at BYU, it's a moot courtroom, by 5 pictures of Jesus, or is it 7? There's a lot. And they're original George Coco paintings. And as I'm walking in one day, I think, that's not right, what I told him. And I started reevaluating, and I started actually praying. I said, God, how do I remove this carve out in my heart where I'm allowed to feel like vengeance against sex offenders? Not that they shouldn't be accountable, but I did feel this sort of hatred, like this anger. And not that I've been abused as a child or even my kids, but just on behalf of those who've had this suffering. And I started praying, and lo and behold, what does God provide me? an opportunity to go to what's called the transition branch. It's a branch that's under the jurisdiction of Elder Don Clarke, where the entire branch, almost primarily, is people charged with sex offenses who have been released from prison, who go to worship every Sunday, and there's not a sacrament service that's provided in this meeting. Many of them have not been rebaptized to be able to have the opportunity to take the sacrament, but it's one of the most inspiring sacrament services I've ever been in, because someone will get up and they read the prayers of the sacrament, reminding everyone what the Savior Jesus Christ has done for their sins. And then, you look around and people are weeping because they no longer have that opportunity to take the bread and the water, and yet they're thinking about Jesus Christ, his body, his blood that's been shed for them, as they're contemplating. And it's honestly the most spiritual experience I've had in a church meeting in my entire life. And I see why Elder Clarke says, nobody wants to be released from this calling to go to a different place, because you see the power of the atonement so strongly. And so I've now repented that I wanted to punish sex offenders anymore, because there's so many, as Elder Clarke might talk about more, that have changed. They've dramatically changed. They've given up that life. They've decided to become new people. Okay, so let's go to our questions now. I think let's have Corinna do this one. So the question for Corinna is, some argue that the death penalty provides closure to victims' families, while others say it prolongs their suffering. What does the research and your experience suggest about the psychological or legal or social impact of capital punishment on survivors and society? Is change possible for people convicted of heinous crimes? You can feel free to share or answer any of that.
I think I answered the first part, that change is absolutely possible. And in fact, I don't know, I didn't count up how many executions, but it was all executions, I guess starting in 1990. So, a whole lot. I've been walking this road. Most of those people, there's a few that go out swinging. Most of them are not. Most of them are just broken people who are deeply regretful. And to your point, I don't comment on it in the book, but I do tell the stories of people being wheeled in wheelchairs to be executed, propped up on a medical pillow because they're on oxygen. It's really debasing. But and you're looking at them going, really? Why? I'll tell one other, just because this just happened. This was Alabama, and this fellow had been convicted of murder, and I think he was executed on the 10th of June, so just last week. He had found Christ and started a death row church. And so he started his own church, and there was a prison chaplain that came in and was speaking. I don't know any of these people, by the way, I'm just, reading, but said to the media, "Rarely have I encountered such holiness in this man." And he talked about how that man right there is reaching people that we can't reach. None of us will be able to reach them. And one of the things that I keep thinking is, we look at this person, I myself have done so, as, okay, this is the person that did X, and we freeze them in this moment in time in our minds. But I think, now after that walk, I'm like, God looks at this and says, that's a God special. Right? Like, when I get finished with what I'm going to do to you, what I'm going to do in your heart, the deeper the despair, the deeper the brokenness, the greater the testimony that they have. And so, there's a line where I say, as Saul became Paul, so it is for many on death row today. So that's the answer to that. As for what it means, I've thought a lot about, what it means for the prison guards, and I just quote them. They say, we have seen them change by the time an execution warrant comes down. We've seen them as a person. We've lived with them. We know that they could safely be housed. and then a warrant comes down and we have to kill them. And what they say is you can't expect that there won't be, a consequence from that. And so I quote family members, that say, well, we just thought Dad was, suffered from depression, was sullen, and didn't want to play with us. Turns out he was the executioner. So like these, one of the things I think of with virtue ethics is, not only like we're killing someone who killed, but is no longer a killer, but who are we creating when we ask someone to kill as a part of their job? And then the victims. So, I think so much about the victims, and I'm actually, because I am a geek, going to write a law review article with another professor at Emory, and we're going to suggest warnings. Actually, you get Miranda warnings. You have warnings on cigarette packages. Things that could harm you. You get warnings. And one of the things I saw again and again, and by the way, I don't speak for any victim, of course, but what I saw again and again is they said at the end, if we had known. If we had known. And it's like these people, these poor people lose their family member. And then really what happens is the state says, and now I'm going to take a decade or 2 or 3 or 4 of your life, and you're going to wait, and you will become bitter. And we understand that. But, they're like, if we had known it would take this long, if we were promised closure, it's the opposite of closure. It's the ultimate betrayal. And I guess one other thing I would just say is that I feel like with forgiveness, it's like these victims, they're tethered to that person because they're waiting for the punishment. And it's like forgiveness is this like set of bolt cutters. And I think some people think, well, I can't forgive because it would be saying it's okay. But really, I think forgiveness is more about us than them, and that in some ways you're saying it is so not okay that I can't be connected to you and what you have done. I need to move on and find the light in my heart and not focus on the darkness. My reading last night was 1 John 46, and I thought, oh my gosh, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can anything good come out of prisons? Can anything good come out of death row? And the answer was, come and see.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, I got to share that with these people.
Yes, we love that. That's so
it.
good. Okay, Jenae. Oh, let me ask you a question. You're like,
Oh, yeah. What's the question?
what's the question? Nobody knows except us. Okay, what do we know from the data about the personal effects of forgiveness, especially when it comes without apology or reparations? How does forgiveness affect our relationship with God? How does our understanding, and does understanding that we all need forgiveness help us forgive others?
Yeah, so I study not only positive development, but also how religion and spirituality help with that. And it helps in so many ways, particularly when we don't have answers. So as a psychologist, I have limitations. And what we know from a secular perspective, we can only take people so far in their development. And we realize at some point we have to hand the baton over to pastors and priests and those who are the holders of religion and spirituality. And we have found through years and years and years of research now that young people who have religion and spirituality as a resource in their life, they thrive and they do better in almost every way that you can imagine, and almost every outcome. From less risk-seeking, less harmful behaviors to more positive civic engagement, better grades, in almost every outcome you can think of. Those individuals who use religion as a resource, they thrive, they do better. And so as a scientist who also happens to be religious, that makes me really happy. I love it when the two are reinforcing, but it's so clear, and you don't hear this as much in the news, right? That it's so clear, the psychological science showing that religion and spirituality are such a resource. Now, specifically, like I said, when we start to reach those limits, a famous psychologist called Irvin Yalom talks about the plights of being, and we have these boundaries and these limits that we come across, and one of them is unfairness. And what do you do with unfairness? What do you do with when somebody harms you, when there's moral injury? How do you manage that? I would submit to you that you can't do it without religion. That's where you will hit the limits of what psychology can do. You need to have some framework for understanding fairness. So some people make the false assumption that forgiveness ignores justice. And we have this aversion to forgiveness precisely because we have this virtue of justice. We want fairness. That's so good. So we don't want to get rid of that inclination. That's a virtue. Having this desire for fairness is a virtue. But how do you manage life when unfair things happen to you? In the Book of Mormon, we have a great scripture that says that mercy cannot rob justice. And so what Christ does for individuals and Christians who believe in the Savior is he provides an answer for that. So justice isn't robbed. And we know that because of Christ, that there is going to be fairness, but that we can release that right that we have to resentment. We can release the right that we have to retribution, and we can hand that over to free ourselves. I love the analogy of those being able to just cut open those chains through forgiveness. And individuals who are able to forgive, not just young people, but anybody who forgives has better mental health. That's just there's years and years and years of research supporting this fact that those who can forgive are more likely to have better mental well-being, but also they're able to have better relationships. So one other thing I want to say about forgiveness is that we often also think about it as being categorical. You either forgive or you don't. Yes, no, yes, no. But I would submit to you, and the research also supports this, that forgiveness is more like a continuum. So there's aspects of forgiveness, and the way that we understand virtue is that it's doing the right thing for the right reasons in the right context. So that means the type of a forgiveness that you apply is going to be different. So if we're looking at the spectrum of types of forgiveness, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person needs to have the same type of forgiveness applied. So let me give you an example. We have something in psychology called decisional forgiveness, which means you just make the decision that you're going to forgive them. You don't change your feelings towards them. You just say, I'm going to forgive. That's decisional forgiveness. You might still harbor resentment. You might still have these bad feelings, but you're just saying, I'm not going to seek retribution. So behaviorally, I'm not going to act out. That's a decision that you make. And then maybe later the emotional forgiveness comes. So emotional forgiveness is then when you replace the resentment, the negative affect with positive. Now I'm going to have compassion. I'm going to have empathy. And there are different types of interventions that you can do that help people work through these different stages. But also remembering that certain types of forgiveness may not necessarily be applied in every situation. So that requires some wisdom and understanding when certain types of forgiveness are needed. And then you have the strong form of forgiveness, which we often think of, which is also involving reconciliation. So you have decisional, emotional, and then you have this reconciliation where you're now back with the person, you're in relation again, and that's obviously not going to be appropriate for everybody, especially with a victim of abuse, for example. So the type of forgiveness that you apply is very dependent upon that situation and as to when it is a virtue or a vice. But these are the types of things that young people need to learn. They need to learn the different stages of forgiveness, and they need to learn the different types of forgiveness that they should apply. And then last, I'll say this. Individuals who receive forgiveness for their sins also have a unique resource for mental well-being. So not only do they have this relational resource of being able to forgive others, but when you receive forgiveness for your own wrongdoings, it's unlocking that hope and that potential for change in an individual's life. And we see that those individuals who receive divine forgiveness are more pro-social and more better adjusted in life.
Wow, so fascinating. I love when the research backs up what we already believe. But okay, to Elder Clarke, many religious traditions preach both justice and mercy. How do you counsel someone who has suffered from the effects of a serious crime and is struggling to forgive? And what does forgiveness look like for offenders who are repentant?
Okay, so first of all, I think there are really two entities that are really important here as it relates to the atonement of Jesus Christ. There's the victims and there's the perpetrators. And these people need as much help as these people. Because if that doesn't happen, then there's hate. And when there's hate, it never works to have a better life. So that's something all of us can do. I know we may have had that happen in our own lives, but that's something we can do. Now let me just share, first of all, here's what Elder Packer said. He said, there is no habit, no addiction, no rebellion, no transgression, no crime exempt from the promise of complete forgiveness. That is the promise of the atonement of Jesus Christ for you and for me and for those that we're talking about today. Now, I've learned a great lesson as we've tried to help men come back into the church after they've done terrible things. I've learned the importance before we move of talking to, especially if it's a wife that's been victimized. And as I sit with them, I come to understand that the husband needs to do more than he's done. Now, he's been in prison. He's served his time. He's paid everything he's supposed to pay. But when you talk to the wife, here's what the story is. Listen, we were married, we had a house, and we had house payments. So after he did his crimes, we were divorced. So he was kind, he gave me the house. But that house didn't seem to be such a great gift because now she has to make the payments on her own. So it really wasn't a great gift because she had to go work 2 jobs so that she could keep the house. And now her income is down by 70%, and so she's living a whole different life. So one of the great lessons I learned is that men, or who are the perpetrators are, need to make generous restitution. So what did we do in this case? This guy had a job that was making this much money. We encouraged him to go get a job that make this much money because he was very capable, which he did. So now he's helping his wife, even though he's not required to. So do you know what's happening with the process of forgiveness? It's moving along. And she feels differently today than she did before because of generous restitution. Another quick story, I think, teach you great principles. We had a guy by the name of, that came out of prison. Shortly after he got out of prison, he got cancer. Shortly thereafter, he died. Every evening that he was in the hospital the last week, somebody from the branch was with him all night. One of the other, we don't call them inmates, we call them residents, one of those on parole. So now we find out he was really estranged from his family, so if he hadn't been a member of this church, this branch that Shima talked about, he would have been cremated and gone, but now there's a funeral, there's a casket, there's all the things that could happen for a person. And so by luck, we found the name of his son that lived in, I forget where he lived. The branch president called his son. Said, I'd like to talk to you about your dad. He said, we want nothing to do with our dad. Nothing. So the family, with what he's done, we are estranged. He said, well, let me tell you who your dad's become. So for the next 20 minutes, he talked about who his dad had become. We get done, and what does the son say? He said, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm proud of my dad. So now we're starting to heal a family. In the other one, we're healing a family. So what we have to do here is you can become players in that. You can help people. There's people out there that you probably know that have got somebody in prison or had somebody in prison, were divorced because of somebody's in prison. And so we are the ministers. Just in my closing comments here for a minute, in Matthew chapter 25, it talks about what we should do. If you remember, the Savior came, it's about the sheep and the goats. And he talks about how you get on his right hand versus his left. And then he talks about the good guys that are on the right hand, the sheep, and the goats on the left. And then they ask him, they said, well, wait a minute. We don't understand when we saw the, let me just read his exact words. When we saw thee hungered and gave thee meat, or thirsty and gave thee drink, or a stranger and ye took me in, naked and ye clothed me. I was sick and ye visited me. And then he says, I was in prison and ye visited me. Now that's very interesting. There's only 6 things he talks about to become a sheep. Now, one of the great travesties of life is men come into prison. Out here, many of them have been members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And many of them receive this many visitors. That's a 0. We can do better. You can help get converts to what we're talking about today. You have to become a convert. When we take people in the first time into prison, they look like they're headed toward outer darkness. We go through gate 1, and then we go through gate 2, then we go through gate 3, and then gate 4, sometimes gate 5. I never, ever felt at risk in the prison. I've been in maximum security. I've been everywhere. First of all, the men would help us faster than the guards. Now this today is really about not us, it's about you. Because this is a group that is so underserved. They can't get jobs, they're the best workers. Recidivism rate for sex offenders is 1%. Now that's not true of drug offense, nor are others. We have this branch where we help men. We have 2. Now, for those that know Utah, Nephi is down the other side of here, several miles. We have 2 young men that travel 90 miles every Sunday to come to our transition branch. We call them the 2 Nephites. We're looking for the 3rd. We're looking for the 3rd. But more importantly, what's phenomenal is to see these 2 young men. Why? Because they gather in this place where they feel help. Okay? Now, I don't know if there's any of those in your wards, but there's more of them around that probably don't attend that we could help. So once again, this thing of helping people find forgiveness does everything. One short story, then I will close. One of the ladies in our branch, in our women's unit, got a call one day from the visiting area from the officer and says, hey, so-and-so is here to see you. She says, I don't know who so-and-so is. He said, you may want to come up anyway. So she came up and she was the guard and she says, who is this guy who wants to see me? He's sitting right there at that table. What's his name? She said, I don't know him. But she went over and sat down and she said, who are you and why are you here? He said, I'm the husband and father of the one you killed driving when you were drunk. She just started to sob. And then he looked at her and he said this, I came here today to let you know that I've forgiven you. And that when you and I get out, you and I are going to go visit teenagers and tell them what happens when people drive drunk. Now, we need to do more to help our teenagers, my friends. We have kids in prison because they did dumb stuff, like get on the internet, talk to young ladies, never really did anything, but they're in prison today. We need to let people know and find out why you can go to prison. These are not bad people. They did something really dumb. Only difference between them and me is my dumb things didn't get me in prison. So I'm honored to be here today and learn and
Thank you.
got my new favorite scripture. So we're all set.
Thank you. I wanted to share a couple points, and then if we have a couple minutes for questions, we'll take them. But 2 things. One is when you think about the victims, right, and crime. And a lot of times my students say, well, what do you right now in the US, we have these long sentences. Well, what's effective when you think about deterring crime? There's two different kind of theories, but one thing that's clear is that certainty of punishment does help. So meaning, if you're pretty certain that you're going to get arrested when you do dumb stuff online or you sell drugs, you're less likely to do it. You're more deterred from that. Whereas severity of punishment, which is really kind of the prevailing theory in the United States, what we've really stuck with incarcerating people for long periods, does not deter crime. So sometimes we've thought as legislators or humans, as policymakers, well, if we give them a 20-year sentence, they won't do it. That actually doesn't work. That's not effective when you think about criminology and the science behind it. And so I wanted to mention that as something for all of us to know as a public, because I think it's really important when we vote and think about these issues that we know what deters crime. Well, it's certainty. So we want more people arrested, especially those to stop them and then hopefully get them to change in the ways that they can in prison or in other ways in jail. But if we allow them to keep committing crimes, that doesn't work. And so none of us on the panel, I can only speak for myself, but none of us are saying, let's stop arresting people, right? Let's stop holding people accountable for crimes. But, putting that aside, I think the other point I really want to emphasize is it's so important to remember to put in context of, kind of when you think about what Dr. Nelson said, criminals or who is a criminal? Well, when you look at the data, and I was looking at this a few years ago when I was looking at policing. I love police. I'm grateful for them taking their lives in their hands basically daily when they go out and interact with some communities that are really difficult and having a lot of problems. But when you look at crime, police spend a very small amount of their time trying to solve crimes and dealing with crimes. They deal most of their time with community order issues, health issues, other types of things. And so when you think of the vast majority of people who are not able to be helped by police, it's quite alarming. So you think, if I gave you the numbers, you'll be shocked, but 20 million people a year are suffer from some sort of serious crime, some serious felony. Of those, only about 2% are police even dealing with. And so when you think about, who gets away with murder, well, 40% of people get away with murder. And of serious felony offenses, about 10% of people are held accountable. And I think what those numbers really teach me with this kind of putting our panel into perspective is that we can't possibly, even with the best police in the world, deal with all of these people committing these crimes. Yes, we want to hold as many accountable, but just the numbers are so great that there's got to be another way societally that we can deal with the crimes that we're affected with that don't see justice in this life, right? They don't see someone held accountable, put behind bars. That's such a minority of cases. And so I know we don't have a ton of time for questions. Maybe we could just take one question, but just to put this in perspective, there's got to be another way. And I think our panelists really articulately and beautifully and powerfully explained that there has to be another way to deal with these crimes. And I think forgiveness might be one way. But we'll take one question if that's okay before we head to lunch. Does anyone have a burning question that they want to ask? Yes, my friend in the front.
This is fascinating. I don't know the answer to this, that's why I'm asking the question. But I understand that Joseph Smith made this part of his presidential platform. What is it that he was proposing?
Okay, I can answer that unless you go ahead.
Joseph Smith proposed to educate rather than to castigate or whatever you want to call it. So Joseph Smith was very much into educating people. Two things keep people out of prison. Number one, relationship with him. Number two, education so they can get a good job so they don't have to do the dumb stuff they did before. So we've recently in the Utah prison here, we put Pathway in the prison. It's going unbelievably well. You can't even fathom how well it's going. We got people lined up to get in, more than we can handle. We have about 220 on right now. We'll put another 100 on in September. And so he proposed that we educate. Now, in prison, there's really bad guys, or really bad guys. But then there's a bunch that are not bad people. And what we can do, what we should do is try to fix the cans and the wannas. The ones that don't wanna, we're probably not gonna do much. So right now, we mix them. So we take a gang guy, and we put this kid that got picked up because he thought about maybe, and he didn't even do it. He went to pull away, got pulled by the police. He's in prison. So here's these gang guys and these guys. That's insanity. Because what's gonna happen? That's why they come to all of our activities. I tell you, we have 70% because we're a refuge from the storm. In our chapels and the areas, we have great facilities out here at the Utah State Prison. Great facilities, classrooms, but it's a refuge. We have one guy that's been to 1,500 activities of the church. Why? Because it's a refuge. He wants to be a good guy. He knows what it feels like to walk into a facility and feel heaven. And that's what Shima talked about. The best testimony meetings in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are in the prison. You can't sit there. You walk in, you think it's sacred ground. Because if he's in town this weekend, he's out at the prison. This is his work that we're talking about here. This is what he cares about. Just like he did when he was on the earth. He cared about those that nobody else cared about. We have to be like him. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't serve, because they have a price to pay. I'm just saying we need to be smarter. We need to help more, and then we need to have things changed, as we talked about here, because it's not working. To put good with bad causes good apples to go bad. So,
Thank you. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I talked to you both.